Hello, friends, and welcome to 3ABN Today Live. My name is John Lomacang. Let me introduce to you our guest for the program, Dr. Timothy Jennings. Good to have you here, Doctor.
Nice to be here, and thank you.
I tell you, I'm going to really enjoy this program, and I know that those who are watching and listening, wherever they're joining us from, are going to have a really good time tonight. I want to remind those of you in the program once again, we're going to be taking questions the second hour, so listen intently. If you had a computer terminal, you could begin sending those questions in even now. But Dr. Jennings, you are a person who has a very interesting background. This book, by the way, is very interesting also, and I'm going to digest it when I get the first chance to do so. But let's let those who have never met you before find out who you are and where you're from, and actually what you do right now.
Well, I am a board-certified psychiatrist.
Okay.
I live in the Chattanooga area with my wife, Christy. I am in private practice in Dalton, Georgia, and I teach a class at my church every week in Collegedale.
Okay. Right there in as we would say, kind of like the small Adventist Mecca of the Midwest South.
Right, exactly.
Okay. And kind of going back on your background, would you say, were you Adventist all your life, or Christian all your life, or raised in a Christian family, I should say?
I sure was. Okay. Absolutely. And that was integral, I think, in helping me become the person I am today.
Okay. At what point, because I know that in some parts of our lives, or at some juncture of our lives, we decide, well, I want to be a doctor. When did that inspiration spark in your mind?
I remember wanting to be a doctor from the earliest memories that I have, and even when I look back at my high school annual and they asked what your plans are for the future, it was to be a doctor.
Okay. So the aspirations were there, but then the field of your concentration, you mentioned a moment ago, is psychiatry. How did you determine that?
Well, that wasn't something I always knew I wanted to do. In fact, when I started medical school, I planned on being a cardiologist. But when I got into my third year of medical school, I found that the mind and the brain were so fascinating and so interesting. And as I understood the warfare between Christ and Satan as a battle for our mind, I was really pulled into the direction of going into psychiatry rather than cardiology.
Okay. So that's been now, when we talk about the battle of the mind, it is, in fact, the battlefield.
Right.
Some people say there's a battle going on in the Middle East, there's a battle in another part of the country or another part of the world, but the battle is everywhere. Everywhere there's a mind, there is a battle. Let's begin by answering the very basic question. I introduced just a moment ago with the question, could it be this simple? Doctor, tell us, what is it?
God's plan to heal and restore us fully into His image.
Okay. So what we're talking about then is the healing of the mind.
Yes.
What about the healing of the brain? How is that different?
That's a great question.
Okay.
As I understand it, and the way I like to describe it is, I like to describe the brain as our hardware, the physical components that make up the structure of the physical organ, our brain, whereas the mind is our software. The way we think, the methods we use, the principles we live by, the beliefs we hold is our software. God is working to restore and heal our software, which is our character, here and now. But the hardware actually won't be fully restored until we get new bodies at the second coming.
Okay. So let's continue along those lines. I like that because I'm very much into computers. So we're saying, in essence, the way that the hardware works is heavily dependent on what's been uploaded.
That's true.
Okay.
That's actually true. Yes, and science is actually showing that more and more every day, that what you think, how you think, the choices you make actually impact the development of the neural circuits, which neurons you keep, which neurons are deleted, depend on the things that you choose and the things that you believe.
So we live in a world nowadays where everything is begging for our attention. I mean, we talk about advertising, we talk about the media blitz, we talk about the commercials on television that seems to get faster and faster by the second. There was a time many, many years ago that a 1-minute commercial was a standard thing, very long, but not unheard of. But nowadays, 15 seconds is, many of the advertisers feel all they need is 15 seconds to persuade you. Let's talk about the impact of the mind, and let's go back to the persuasive elements of the mind. Particularly, how important is it for us to guard our minds?
Oh, it's incredibly important. And it's more important as children, but it's still important as adults. And the reason for that is, when we come into the world as birth, we have hundreds of millions of neurons more at birth than we do by the time we're 7, 8, 10 years of age. The first 7 to 10 years of life, your brain is actually deleting neurons, knocking them off. Why would that be? It doesn't sound like a good thing, does it? Think of Michelangelo's block of marble.
Okay.
Michelangelo's block of marble when he gets it and when he's finished with it. When he's finished with it, he has much less marble. but he has a masterpiece.
Okay.
Our brains come into the world prepared for the development based on the experiences, the teaching, the training, the education, what we go through in our environment. The brain will adapt itself based on what we give it. Thus, we've heard the tragic stories of young people who have been abused and locked away, and no one has spoken a language to them for 10 years of their life. And then when they're finally taken out of that terrible situation, they don't have the ability to speak. They can't learn language because the neurons that are responsible for that are gone.
Okay.
In our development, there are critical neurons for good, healthy thinking. They're the neurons right behind our forehead, the prefrontal cortex. Those neurons, when we watch a lot of theatrical programs like television and things, the media blitz that you were talking about a moment ago, those neurons get put on pause, let's say. They don't get the activity they would if we were involved in other healthier activities, while neurons deeper in the brain, which give us emotions and reactions, anger and irritability, those emotions get very much activated. And so if you're doing much of this theatrical television watching, then these neurons over time that give us these impulses of aggression and hostility get stronger. Well, the neurons that need to develop in the prefrontal cortex, they give us the ability to reason, think, self-restrain, self-govern, organize, prioritize. Those neural circuits are not developed like they should, and science has shown that the more television you watch as a child, the higher your risk of violence as an adult. The more television you watch as a child, we're talking theatrical television again now, not programs like this, okay? The more television you watch as a child, the greater your risk for attention deficit disorder. So there's a definite impact on the things that we are putting into our mind in the software and what actually happens to the development of the hardware.
So what, in essence, I'm hearing you say, and I'm going to put this in very simplistic layman terms, somebody has found out the way to bypass our reasoning.
Yes.
Okay. So the subconscious is being bombarded and the conscious mind is being ignored in much of the theatrical world that we live in. Much of the commercials, much of the television is bypassing our door that we say, okay, sure, I'll allow this. No, I won't allow that. It's designed to just bypass our reasoning and find its way into our emotional center. So we become people that respond with a tear or with laughter or with anger instantly based on what the theatrical program is that we're watching, rather than saying, should I really cry because they're not really dying?
Exactly.
Okay.
Exactly.
Okay.
And this is actually then leads us to interact with people from an emotional base rather than good judgment base. It's a powerful insight, yes.
So therefore, then, with the world developing us the way that we are, then we could be a people that's highly excited one moment and severely depressed the other moment.
It certainly has an impact, and science is showing this. Okay. The reaction of the prefrontal cortex. And maybe I could take you through that, how mood disorders we're understanding affect our physiology and affect our body and brain. Just very quickly. I think everyone's familiar with the experience of taking a walk in nature.
Right.
And out of the corner of their eye, see something slithery, and their heart rate starts pumping, their muscles start reacting. They get the rapid breathing because what's happening is your adrenaline surge is kicking in because an alarm has gone off somewhere deep in the brain. It's part of the brain called the amygdala. Anyway, a few seconds later, your prefrontal cortex catches up and says, oh, it's just a rubber hose. You recognize it's just a rubber hose. And that prefrontal cortex sends the message down to the deeper parts of the brain, it's not danger, you can relax, you can calm. Okay. And the calming signal comes from the prefrontal cortex. What happens when we have negative thoughts, unhealthy thoughts, false beliefs about God that keep us afraid of Him and insecure of Him, then instead of sending the calming signals down, we send the signals that keep the alarm turned on. We keep the stress hormones kicked up, the glucocorticoids, which actually have been documented to release toxic little terrorists in our body called cytokines that go around and damage brain cells. Brain volumes are reduced. This contributes to depression and also damage insulin receptors in the body, kicks up increased risk of metabolic syndrome, diabetes, and everything else. Based on the negative thinking that we have, these consequences can occur.
So we go anywhere from hypertension to diabetes to being severely depressed.
Yes.
Okay, so those are the layman terms. We could be hyperactive, we could be closing our curtains, being locked into our room, shut down life, stop working in society, socially inept. Everything could begin to happen based on what's happening in our mind.
There's no question about it. That has actually been shown to be true.
So, I mean, in 2006, it was documented that more than 10 million Americans take antidepressants. What do you think is behind that?
Well, I think the Bible also says at the end of time, men shall run to and fro, their hearts failing them for Fear.
Okay.
Fear is that amygdala firing, that alarm center firing, kicking up all those stress hormones that cause all this damage and lead to depression. And so the more fear we have, then the more likely we are to succumb at some point to depression. Now, I do want to say also that there are causes of depression that don't have to do with the way we think.
Okay.
Depression can come, and I like to break it into two camps, what we talked about earlier, hardware assaults and software assaults. Somebody that has mad cow's disease, a hardware assault on their brain, they can get depressed. HIV assaults the brain, you can get depressed. Hypothyroidism, hormone irregularities, postpartum changes that occur in aftermath of a child, hardware assaults on the brain. So, and there's many, many more, toxins, mercury, arsenic poisoning, lead poisoning, all these different things can assault the brain and cause depression. So the fact that we're talking about the software's impact on the hardware, we don't want to forget all those other hardware assaults directly that can impact the brain.
Some of the hardware impacts or the hardware assaults, could it be what we're also taking in our diet? Let me give you an example. We talk about antidepressants. Well, I think we live in a country or in a world where people, the alarm clock is the first thing, the cup of coffee is the second, and the sleeping pills fall third. I've been up all day long. I've been keeping myself up all day long. Now I have to find a way to go down. So we need something to wake us up, something to put us to bed. I mean, does that have any impact on the hardware, the body?
Absolutely it does.
Okay.
And you've even implicated another aspect, and that is irregular sleep patterns.
Okay.
Sleep disorders, obstructive sleep apnea, or people who just push themselves so long that they don't give their brain and body the rest that it needs will exhaust the physical organ, the brain, and contribute to increased risk for depression. And then they stimulate themselves with stimulants to try to overcome the fatigue that they're driving their brain from not giving it proper rest. So yes, what you're describing is absolutely true, another hardware assault on the brain. And then what happens, they maybe don't do as well in their job, maybe they're falling behind because they don't focus, and as they make mistakes, then the negative thinking comes in, and they start criticizing themselves. You're no good, you're not as sharp as other people, what's wrong with you? And that starts the software cascade of assaults on the brain and contributes to depression. So both impact. The software and the hardware synergistically work together.
Now, we're going to talk about how this got into the world, because I would imagine that each of us wants to know how did we get to where we are nowadays? I mean, how did the world get to a place where it's people are so depressed, we're fearful of so many different things, fearful of financial failure, job insecurity, relationship insecurity, we're fearful of noises, we're fearful of a person's name, at the smell of a certain odor or scent, fear could be instilled, something that moves, all of a sudden fear comes. We are in a fear-driven society. I want to go back a little bit, though, because I know that this book has a lot of Christian-based teaching in it. Because we are...
Can I jump in with you, though?
Go right ahead.
I want to jump in on the fear, because you
like
just
that.
set that up so well that I want to comment on that.
Okay.
When God created Adam and Eve in the garden,
That's where I was going.
He created them without fear.
Okay.
Perfect love casts out fear. They were created in perfect love.
All right.
In this world, there are two antagonistic principles at war. God's principle of self-sacrificing love, which was summed up in Christ's statement, greater love has no man, that He give His life for a friend, which means, I love you so much. I will do anything for your health, your welfare, your good, including, if necessary, I'll give my life that you might live.
Okay.
Which is at war with Satan's principle of fear and selfishness, commonly known today as survival of the fittest, which says, I love myself so much that I'll do anything to promote myself, exalt myself, advance myself, including, if necessary, kill you, that I might live. Give my life that you might live, kill you, that I might live. These two principles are at war in this world right now. And as we pursue the principle of self-exaltation, the principle of selfishness, survival of the fittest, it only incites more fear, more anxiety, more worry, more stress. And so we're out to get more, get more. The more we get, it's still not enough. We've got to get more. We're afraid we could lose it at any minute. Perfect love, however, we stop looking to self and we start caring about God and caring about others, and we want to give to make others' lives better. We're no longer concerned with what happens to ourselves, and that prefrontal cortex sends a calming signal down to the amygdala. The fear goes away, and a merry heart doeth good like a medicine.
And the reason I was going back to that, you picked up on that very, very well. That's why I'm glad you jumped in. In the very beginning, if you see that whole scenario played out in Genesis chapter 3, on the heels of disobedience, the fear was born.
That's right.
And then Adam hid himself because he was afraid.
That's right. It's part of the infection of sin.
Okay.
And as God heals us, as we come closer and closer to Him in our relationship, as we experience more of the Spirit regenerating, recreating us in His image, we have less and less fear in our lives. And I tell patients in their marital relationships, a barometer that you can use to tell where you stand in love in your relationship is how much fear you have in your relationship with your spouse. Because the more fear you have of your spouse, the less love that's there. But the more that love goes up, the less and less fear you have.
You know, our Constitution has, or our Bill of Rights, what's that? We have freedom, pursuing life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness.
That's right.
Am I correct? I think that's
right. Life,
okay.
Liberty, and the pursuit of happiness.
So now in the Christian arsenal, there is liberty, love, forgiveness, and faith. A different context altogether. Because the pursuit of happiness may also include some of the elements of Adam, which mean in order to be happy, I've got to hide. So for those who say that they are Christians through and through, and they will never succumb to mental illness, what do you say to that?
Well, I would say to them that when Adam sinned, genetic vulnerabilities entered our gene pool. We are not as physically healthy as Adam was when he came from the hand of God. Our physical bodies are subject to disease and decay. And we have an organ that resides in the top of our head, called our brain, that is subject to physical disease and decay. And that organ can suffer from an illness called depression or other mental illness, schizophrenia, bipolar disorder, Alzheimer's, dementia. All these disorders are physical disorders of the brain itself. The question is, why is the brain altered in this way? What is actually causing the brain to be altered in this way? And for many of these disorders, it's more than one cause. It's not a specific cause that you can identify with one infecting element. And so I would tell people that as long as we live in this world of sin, even Christians will suffer with mental illness. I know many good Christian folk whose family members are suffering with Alzheimer's dementia right now. Why is that the case? Because we live in a world where our biology fails with time.
Okay. Which one do you think would be greater then? Because I want to bring this down so people can begin to look at this equation in a very simplistic form. There is the mind effect on the body, and there's the body's effect on the mind. Help me understand which one. How do you know when the body is in control of the way the mind is thinking, or if one is the victim of the other? In other words,
it's a great question, and it's often very difficult to tease out.
Okay.
I ask my patients, if I were to take a pin and stick it somewhere in your body, could I stick it somewhere in your body that you didn't know it? And they go, no. See, the brain is wired into every part of your body.
Okay.
Every part of your body the brain is wired into. Not only does it receive the signals coming from the body, but it can send signals back out to the body. And so if we have unhealthy physiology, who wants to go take their final exams with a fever of 103 degrees? We understand our brain isn't working right. Our physical body affects our brain. Conversely, though, people who are under high stress, who worry, can have the cascade of stress hormones, which can lead to stress ulcers, colitis, other GI symptoms, the ones we all get generally sometime in our life, sweaty palms, butterflies on the stomach. These are physical symptoms coming from stress in our minds.
So people sometimes say, well, I don't feel that I'm going to succeed. I don't feel that I'm able to make it. I mean, are feelings reliable, or when are they not reliable? Because I know a lot of times people can fail or succeed based on how they feel.
This is a great question. And in my book, one of the things that I've done in the book is tried to diagram God's original organizational model for our mind.
Okay.
The faculties which He designed to govern us, to direct our thinking and thoughts. The highest faculties, our ability to reason and our conscience together jointly form our judgment, which are to direct the power of choice, the will. Below those faculties, we have the things we believe, and below those faculties, we have our emotions or our feelings.
Okay.
Which
Just
are always...
go over that one more time. You stated three...
Yes, several things really fast. In the book, I go into more detail.
Okay.
But for your audience today, to keep it simple for those who are watching, we basically have those parts of our mind that do our reasoning and thinking,
Okay,
our
great.
good judgment.
All right.
We have the part that does the choosing,
Okay.
And we have the part that does the feeling.
All right.
Okay? There's just kind of a very simple overview.
Mm-hmm.
God designed that our think and reasoning parts should evaluate facts, evidences, circumstances, draw conclusions that the will acts upon to choose to direct the course of our life.
Mm-hmm.
And then the feelings follow behind, always to be part of the experience, but never to be the engine that leads the direction of where we go. A good example I like to give my patients, people who live their lives with the feelings in charge are like bobbers, fishing bobbers on the ocean. Whichever way the waves of emotion are going, that's where their life's going. They're up, they're down, they're left, they're right, they're front, they're back. They're just going all over with their emotions, and their life is chaotic and has no direction. Mm-hmm. People who keep their judgment in charge and choose with their will to follow their judgment are like ships on the ocean. They still have all the waves of emotions to deal with. But they can chart their course through the difficult emotions of life and take their life in the direction that God has ordained for them.
Okay, so you're not what you're in essence saying, and I want you who are listening and watching the program to get this, because we've been mentioning a lot of terms that, to some degree, may go over the layman's head, and but when you reiterate those things, it becomes very, very clear. It's not so much what surrounds me, and I'm hearing you say this. It's not so much what surrounds me, but the very makeup of my attitude towards what surrounds me.
Excellent. Yes.
Okay. The ocean, the ship.
Yes, we are not responsible for what happens to us. We are responsible for how we react and deal with what happens to us.
Okay. That's powerful, because you know what, children are raised in homes where I know some children that are 40, 50 years old, 35 years old. And I use the word children because they never got past their childhood experiences. And they said, well, I couldn't control what happened, but still they fail to realize it is their reaction to what happens is really the issue, the bigger issue at hand. And we're not by any means classifying and giving credence to what happened, but they're saying 50 years down the road, 40 years down the road, 30 years down the road, they're still at that childhood stage. What contributes to that?
That's a great question. In childhood, children, of course, are vulnerable to being exploited because of their position, because of their size, because of their mentality, because they're children. They're vulnerable to being exploited. When that happens, damage occurs on multiple levels. Damage occurs to the psychology, the software, bad object relations. In other words, bad modeling. They learn relationships functioning in dysfunctional ways, and that's how they see relationships. They internalize that, and they think this is how relationships work. Bad internalization, bad software. Mm-hmm. They have bad self-image. They think of themselves in ugly and distorted ways because of the ugly treatment that they're receiving. Mm-hmm. But more than that, we've actually shown now that when this terrible abuse happens in childhood, damage is happening to the brain itself. Mm-hmm. The very important circuits of the brain that are important for critical thinking, good reasoning, self-restraint are impaired in their development, while the circuits that give passionate, strong feelings, anger feelings, fearful feelings, insecurity feelings, they're inflamed and expand. And so these kids come into adulthood not only with the distortions in how things work and what they think and believe, but they also come in with brains that are a little hampered in their ability to have good self-governance on a biologic level as well. Mm-hmm. And so to approach helping people like this, we have to approach them in several factors. We want to calm the biology down enough that we can start engaging those good prefrontal cortex critical circuits to teach them how to think, how to restrain, but also help to work through these difficulties at childhood. Mm-hmm. The child it's not the child's fault that they internalized what happened to them in a distorted way. They can't help it when they're children.
Right.
But once they're an adult, they have the ability to review the events of what happened to them. Mm-hmm. Not to change them, because we can't change historical fact.
Right.
But we can change how that historical fact was internalized as an adult. And what I mean by that, just a quick example, let's say a child was abused on their 6th birthday. Mm-hmm. And how that child internalized that all these years is, I'm gross, I'm ugly, I'm nasty, I'm worthless. Mm-hmm. As an adult, they can look back and say, wait a minute, when an adult person abuses a 6-year-old child, Who is the one who has the problem? Who is the ugly one, the abusive one, the nasty one, the difficult one? It wasn't the 6-year-old. It was the adult. I've had that file, that fact of history has been put in the wrong place in my mind. I need to reallocate that and refile that under, hey, wait a minute, I was just an innocent kid. There wasn't anything wrong with me. There was something wrong with the person who abused me.
So for those who end up blaming themselves, they have to remember that they have to remove that file from self-blame to point the blame where it really lies.
Yes, and of course, what is this process we're doing right now? You will know the truth.
And the truth.
And the truth will set you free.
Set you free.
Yes.
Isaiah 1:18 is at the root of the title of your book. You'll get a chance to see a copy of this. Can it be this simple? The biblical model for healing the mind. And I like that fact that you use the word healing the mind, and we'll let our viewers and listeners know how to get a copy of this before the program is over. But Isaiah 1:18 has a lot to do with, we talk about the power of reason or the power of belief. How is that different from just positive thinking?
What we believe has incredible power on who we become. And in fact, the entire great controversy between Christ and Satan started over a belief.
Okay.
Let me give you a quick example of how that works. You said hello to your wife in Florida a little while ago.
Yes.
And I'm going to just assume, because you haven't described for me, but the way you talked and the brightness in your smile, that you have a loving and happy and healthy marriage.
Yes, we do.
Yes. Well, let's, for the sake of our illustration, say that someone came to you and began to whisper lies in your ear, that somehow they were so deceptive and so subtle they were able to persuade you to believe a lie, no truth in it now. But you believe now your wife's been having an affair. If you believe that lie, does something inside you change?
Oh, I think your mind's attitude changes immediately.
Do you have the same peace? Do you experience anxiety? And how about if you not only believe that lie, but there's a little lie added to it that the person she's having an affair with and she are plotting to kill you? If you believe both of those lies, would you even want to go home and be in the room with her?
No. You'd actually not want to go home.
And Lucifer in the garden said, did God really say, in the day you eat, you will die? Oh, no, you won't.
Did he really say?
He didn't say that. You can't trust him. And they believed a lie about God himself, and love and trust were broken. I'm going to take you through this cascade. When you believe a lie, if you believe the lie about your wife, love and trust have been broken.
That's right.
When love and trust are broken, selfishness and fear come in. I don't trust you anymore. I'm afraid of you. I'm not loving you and looking out for your interest. I'm looking out for myself. Soon as selfishness and fear come in, then destructive behaviors take place. I better get that fruit now before God gets rid of that tree and I lose my chance. And we begin to act out on sinful acts or sinful behaviors. And those behaviors that we act on damage our minds, characters, and body. This is a terminal condition. Without God's grace, without his treatment, without his intervention, this condition is terminal.
Wow. So that shows that the mind and the health are interwoven inseparably.
Absolutely.
We are, as we look at this book, you talk about the law of liberty. Let's talk about the law of liberty. We know that this refers in Scripture in James 2 to the commandments of God, but you have an expanded view of the law of liberty. Let's talk about that for a moment.
Yeah, I see the law of liberty as a principle that emanates from the character of God himself, a principle upon which the universe runs. And when I say law, I don't mean a legislative enactment.
Right.
I mean that principle upon the universe runs, very much like the law of gravity. And if I were to say to you, well, which government decided to pass gravity anyway? Exactly, you laugh because you realize that's silly. It's a principle. It's not dependent on what people think. You don't have to believe in it or know about it. You can even deny it, but if you jump off a building, gravity's still there working, even if you deny it. It's not dependent on your belief.
It's not suspended.
It's not suspended by your belief. The same thing is true for the law of liberty. You don't have to believe in it. You can deny it. You can pretend it doesn't exist, but there are predictable consequences when you violate it. And let me give you those examples very quickly, because it is integral. If you want a happy marriage, if you want a healthy relationship, being in harmony with this principle brings healing. Violating it always brings destruction. Imagine a young man who has a woman that he's met, they've dated, he's fallen in love, and he wants to marry her. He proposes, but she isn't quite to that point, so asks for a little while to think about her answer. Well, he becomes insecure and his fear takes over. He reaches into his pocket, he pulls out a pistol, he puts it to her head, and he says, "No, look, I've been spending time on you, I'm spending money on you. You better marry me and you better love me, because if you don't, I will kill you." Now, this is an extreme example, but if he does that, it exposes the first two predictable consequences when liberties are violated. Does the woman respond with, oh, this is the man I've been looking for? Does love get stronger in her heart, or does love get damaged when he does this?
Terribly damaged.
When you violate liberties, first consequence, love is damaged and eventually will be destroyed. Second consequence, does she want to get closer or does she want to get away?
She wants to run away.
So the principle of rebellion is instilled. So violate liberties, love is damaged, and the desire to rebel is instilled. If you find yourself in a situation like that, where liberties, and let me back up just a moment and say to our audience, it's not just a gun to the head. Most people don't use in their relationships physical guns. They use what I call emotional guns. What are emotional guns? It's when you don't do what your spouse wants and they holler, they stomp, they criticize, they pout, they slam doors, they don't cook dinner, they don't pick up their laundry, or there's a price to pay. You know in your relationship what it is, and you feel that pressure that if you don't do it, that trigger will be pulled and you will pay a price for not doing what your partner wants. Liberties are being violated. And when that happens, love is being damaged, a desire to rebel is being instilled. If you voluntarily surrender to that and continue to succumb to that voluntarily now, over the course of time, the third consequence happens. And that third consequence is individuality is slowly eroded and destroyed, and you eventually become what I call a shadow person. A shadow of the one who controls you. You think through their eyes. You see the world through their eyes. And you approach decision-making through what they would have you do, rather than exercising your own God-given individuality. It's extremely destructive.
So that's how people can become a copy of someone else's mind.
Yes.
When they have been dominated for so long, or broken down, or restricted, or their liberties have been taken from them, and they have been coerced or forced into, you will do this or else this marriage is over.
That's exactly right.
Yeah.
And I bet as a counselor, you've seen people who had this happen. And I have a patient I can think of right now whose husband was extremely abusive, who he had multiple affairs, criticized her, beat her. Eventually, he left her 5-6 years ago. She comes to my office regularly, and every session she cries for him. She wants him back. And I asked, do you want to be beaten? Do you want to be hit? No. But she can't think without him. She can't function without him because she had surrendered completely her own sense of self to him. He is herself now.
That's the cult mentality to a great degree.
Yes, it is. Cults work in the same way. They dominate, they control, they take away individual liberties, and they slowly erode your identity and individuality to the leader of the cult, whoever that leader might be.
That's why we say, how could somebody who seemed to have been so wise, I mean, this guy was highly educated. I mean, he has so many degrees. This person, I knew them, and we had wonderful conversations. I don't know what happened. Did they snap all of a sudden, that they just follow this cult leader off into the dark? Things like that also happen on a one-to-one basis relationship.
Absolutely.
Let me look at the flip side. Let me ask this question. Now, I just posed the threat question. You'll do this or else. But what about people that say in a very manipulative way, if you love me, you'll do that?
That's an excellent question. Because
that's a different one altogether.
Yes, but the same things happen because you're under the threat of, I don't want to hurt them. I don't want to make them feel bad. And you've been duped into thinking that you are somehow responsible for how other people feel. We are not responsible for how other people feel. We are responsible for our conduct, our actions, and our decisions.
I'm so glad. That's why I posed two of those illustrations, because one is done out of fear and almost subtle coercion all the way to the point from silence to violence.
Yes.
You see, some people, they're silent. And I've heard also people say, well, we've never had a conflict in all the years we were married. What is that a diagnosis of?
Well, if there hasn't been any disagreement or of any kind, it says that there's only one entity functioning there.
Right.
There aren't two individuals who have their own identity, their own individuality, their own ability to think and reason, and share those freely with each other. Somebody has had to give in and surrender totally their identity to the other, lest there should, God forbid, be a disagreement.
Yeah, exactly. So people say, we always agree on everything. I mean, let's talk about the facade behind that. When a person or when a couple says, we always agree, we never disagree. Let's talk about the unrealistic approach there.
Well, I think, again, it's what we just described, that there's fear that if they should disagree, that somehow love would be damaged, the person wouldn't care for me, the relationship couldn't tolerate the stress of a disagreement or an argument, and it actually is a reflection of a very fragile relationship, not a relationship of strength. A relationship of strength allows freedom for each person to be themselves, express themselves, have differences of opinion, but love doesn't change just because you disagree with me.
Right. Now, how individual are we? I'm asking this question. It almost seems like the answer is in the question. How individual are we as far as persons are concerned? There's a reason behind the question. How unique are each of us? Is each of us?
Every person is unique. Even if we were to one day go past the ban and have a human clone, and that clone is an identical clone of some other human being, that person is still a unique being because they have different software. They have different experiences of childhood. The neural network will be pruned in a different way than the original neural network was pruned. So their brains actually won't be identical even though they're genetically identical. So we're all unique. Parents,
there are people watching the program that have 2 children, 3 children. Some people have 8, like my mother-in-law did. I'm glad she did have 8 because the 8th one became my wife. But for parents who say, I don't know what's wrong with my children. One is so obedient and the other one is just so rebellious. And same parents, same mom, same dad. What contributed to that kind of difference in the children?
Differences in temperament,
okay.
Differences in the way they approach and interact, differences in biological predispositions. All of these could be, and also there can have different experiences that contributed to how their neural network was pruned during the developmental years of life. One child may have had a experience where they were mistreated at school by someone, and the parent doesn't even know about it. And that child is suffering under the scars of that because they were ashamed to tell mom or dad this happened. I have patients as adults who were molested or abused, and they were ashamed to tell, and they didn't tell, but they were dealing with things like that.
What about the phrase, the apple does not fall far from the tree? You've heard that before. Tell me in a predisposed way, because a lot of people say, well, if you had a chance to meet your father, who passed away unfortunately before you were born, you're just like him. Let's talk about that.
Well, you know, in the Bible, in one of the commandments, it says that the sins of the fathers are passed down to the 3rd and 4th generation of them. I don't think this is God pronouncing that He's going to inflict this upon us.
Right.
I think this is a reality of the fact that He created us in the Garden of Eden with Adam. He said, for Adam to be fruitful and multiply, and for him to create beings in his image. And we have children with gene constellations very similar to where we are. The interesting thing that we are discovering, however, is the choices you make in your life today can actually alter which genes that you have turned on, which genes you have turned off, how they are actually being expressed. Even the foods that you eat can affect certain gene expression. This has been being documented now. And so how we live our lives can actually be passed along. For instance, I'll give you a quick example. If you use cocaine or methamphetamine, crack, or crank, a gene with one hit, one dose of these abusive tree substances, there's a gene that gets turned on in the brain called cocaine-amphetamine reactive transcript that was not turned on before, producing this protein that increases your craving for more cocaine and more amphetamine. That's why it is so addictive with just one hit. If you have experienced that, kick this gene on, you increase the risk of passing a vulnerability to addiction along to your children.
It's an acronym CART. You know, that's an amazing thought, because a lot of people are thinking that, well, I was born this way. I've heard that phrase used so much. And to some degree, they are talking about predisposition, but on the other side of that, they're talking about inherited tendencies.
And the Bible teaches in Psalms 51 that David says he was conceived in sin and born in iniquity. We are all born biologically predisposed with self-centeredness. The self-centeredness has 3 main avenues. 1 John tells us the lust of the flesh, the lust of the eyes, and the pride of life. We all have vulnerabilities that tempt us in certain unique ways for us, but they're in these 3 main avenues of sensualism, materialism, or egotism. The good news of the gospel is, regardless of your genetic vulnerabilities, there is power through God's grace and His Spirit to actually experience victory over those vulnerabilities, transformation of neural networks so that you can live a life of love rather than a life of selfishness through the power and grace of God here and now on this earth. You don't have to be dominated by those.
So is there, what I'm hearing you say there is, no matter at what point we are in life, it may get more difficult as we get older, the longer we fail to do so, but we do have the freedom to change the way that we're thinking.
Yes, and when we make the choice to go in a healthy direction, we are not left to do this in our own strength. We receive divine power that strengthen us to follow through with this. Our minds are actually imbued with divine energy. Peter says we become partakers of the divine nature. Now, I want to clarify for your audience, in case anybody is getting confused out there, I am not speaking of illnesses like bipolar disorder, schizophrenia, and these types of things. We are talking about character now. You see, a person can have schizophrenia and still be honest and loyal and faithful and loving and kind. A person can have no diagnosable mental illness and be selfish and arrogant and prideful and lustful and gluttonous, And so when we talk about these tendencies toward evil, I'm talking about the tendencies towards self-centeredness, a software problem that infects our very nature. And through God's grace, we can overcome that now.
For the person who has said, or does say, or maybe is in the present situation, they said, I have been trying my whole life to break this thing, or to change this cycle. And they get to the point where they give up and they become introverted, turned into self-destruction. And whatever the behavior may be, it manifests itself in one way, destroying the mind, destroying the body, destroying the life, and eventually the person just dies. What could we say? Is that something that a person can be freed from? I've been trying, but I just can't find a way to be set free. Is there still hope for that kind of a person?
I guess I would want to know a little bit more specifically about what they've been trying to be set free from. Because it does sometimes make a difference. Sometimes people are trying to be set free from something that they believe is a problem that is not a problem in God's Word.
Wholly in their mind.
It's wholly in their mind, yes. And so the real setting free is to realize what they've been struggling against isn't anything they really need to worry about.
Because some people, I've referred to the fact, and this is realistic, the Bible says, thou shalt have no other gods before me. Well, in the world, the gods show up in various ways. It could be money, it could be lust, it could be food, it could be fame, it could be a desire to be on top all the time, it could be competitive, it could be entertaining. The gods manifest themselves in various ways. Could those addictions be broken if the person could identify what that god is and begin to approach it and say, I need to be free from that?
Oh, there's no question addictions can be broken. It starts with the step one of recognizing you have a problem. And a power outside yourself. What you described a moment ago was a person that was doing this on their own self-will, not actually surrendering their life to God and reaching outside of themselves for healing power that comes from the Spirit of God.
What about a person who says, this is the way my mother did it, this is the way my grandmother did it, this is the way her mother did it. I mean, this is the way we do things in our family, and it's a tradition, and I've got to stick with the tradition. I know it's just harmful, but that's just the only thing I know. What do you say to that person?
I would say that that is one of the signs that reason is turned off. See, in my book, I identify common practices in Christianity that actually are harmful to the mind. Harmful to the mind because it's damaging those faculties of reason and conscience that truth enters the mind through. One of those is the common one that you just identified. Well, my mother's believed it, I've done it this way, my grandmother's believed it and done it this way, my pastor, he's such a nice guy, he does it this way. Yeah, but why are you doing it? Well, because they do. Are you thinking for yourself if you do that? Do you have an underpinning, a reason for why you are practicing or living your life in this way? No. Your character is not being transformed. It's actually being infantilized.
So people pretty much line up in life based on whether or not they're the ones that are leading or whether or not somebody else is leading.
Yes. Yes, no, and much of our society, actually, you mentioned earlier with the media, Blitz, our society conditions people to surrender their judgment and their individuality to others and follow along in groups.
In other words, call right now while the free offer lasts. No interest for the next 90 days or the next 16 months or the next year and a half.
Yeah, the advertising, the commercialization, and how people are so influenced by that. And they don't stop and think through their own situation, their own circumstances, what their real needs are, and make intelligent choices for how they're going to conduct their business.
So that could fall in the category of the lust of the eyes. I see it, I want it, I have to find a way to get that self-gratification satisfied.
Yes.
And I don't care about the penalty right now. I'll work that out later.
Exactly. Exactly. The feeling or desire is trumping judgment. It's not that they don't have judgment. It's that judgment has not been placed in its proper position of governance over the person. In any situation we find ourselves in life, it doesn't matter the situation. If you let your feelings trump your judgment, it always results in damage to the inner man. And I could give scenario after scenario. You're at the school board, and they pass a rule that you're in disagreement with, and you have a feeling of anger that tempts you to stand up and say something ugly. Your judgment kicks in and says, well, that's probably not the best course of action. Let me instead calm myself down and address them in a professional manner. If you go with your feelings instead, and the feelings trump the judgment, and you say something ugly in this way, your self-esteem, self-worth, self-confidence will all fall. You will feel guilt on the inner man. Damage will occur to you. If you're in a situation where you have feelings of an arousal of nature to someone of the opposite sex who is not your spouse, and your judgment will immediately kick in and tell you this is not right. But if you go with the feelings and let the feelings trump your judgment, damage occurs to the inner man. I could go through any kind of feeling that you want to go through, feelings of fear and insecurity. If you let feelings of fear of rejection, fear of what people think about you, trump your judgment in any situation, and you go with your fear, you damage yourself in the inner man.
Wow. So all of these, for every action, what I'm hearing you say is there's an equal and opposite reaction. There is a consequence no matter how you look at it.
And yes, it doesn't mean that we should ignore our feelings, however. We should take our feelings, examine them in the light of evidence and truth with the judgment God has given us, and then determine the course of action and how to deal with those feelings best given the situation. Sometimes the feelings simply can't be acted on, even though they're genuine and they're truthful. For instance, it's 2 o'clock in the morning and your baby cries wet and hungry, and you feel tired and feel like staying in bed.
Your feelings are...
Well, you can't act on those feelings. Those feelings must be overridden by your judgment. You must choose with your will to get up and care for that child if you want to have peace within. But if you let the feelings trump and you turn over and go back to bed, you will damage yourself. You will not have peace. You will have restlessness, low self-esteem. Damage will occur in the inner man. Feelings, however, can lie. And many of my patients don't know this. Just because you feel it doesn't mean it's true. And what we have to do when we have a feeling of any kind, we have to not ignore it, not just ride over it, not just suppress it down. We have to elevate it to our good judgment. Examine this feeling. Why am I feeling this way? Where is it coming from? And what are God's methods and principles for bringing peace back to my soul?
We talk about ministry, but we also talk about worship. And I want to start with this question. We have a number of questions here to pose, and we're going to get to that, but just talk about worship. Everyone worships.
Yes. In fact, there's a law of worship. It's one of the highest faculties that God made us with. The reason everyone worships is because God created us, and He designed us for worship. It's one of the highest faculties. It separates us from the animals. And worship is a looking outside of oneself for a frame of orientation that gives life meaning, direction, and purpose. Now, people do not have to worship God. As you mentioned earlier, they could worship anything. But the reason, and I like to help people understand this, the reason God says, thou shalt have no other gods before me, is not because God needs our worship, or He feels insecure, or He gets His feelings hurt if we don't. It's because of this principle of modeling. By beholding, we become changed. We actually assimilate and become like the God we worship. And as the highest created beings on this planet, there is nothing on this planet we can worship that will tend to our development. Anything we worship on this planet will only degrade us. The only way we can grow and fulfill God's purpose in our creation is to worship Him, the Infinite One.
To me, it reminds me of people that look up. Now, you can look up and see the top of a tree, or you could look up and see the stars. Quite a different distance, quite a magnificent difference in distance, but as you look up you see the same thing almost simultaneously, the top of the trees and the stars. Some people may look at their worship as, well, I'm looking in the same direction you're looking, but I'm not seeing the same thing.
Oh, and that's a key thing that you just said, because I have people that tell me, sometimes they'll say to me, I don't believe in God. And I'll say, why don't you tell me about the God you don't believe in? And as they describe him for me, I almost invariably end up saying, good for you. I don't believe in him either. Because they will describe some horrible, distorted, twisted picture of God. And the most important thing that I think we can tell and do in our lives is to reveal the truth about God as Christ revealed him to us.
This truth about God is so vitally important to stimulating our neurons, to putting us center where God wants us to be. But a person did ask a question, a lady by the name of Anna from Texas. She says, what activities help stimulate the neurons in the frontal lobe?
Well, the brain is a balanced organ. And in order to have healthy brain development, we want a balance of activities in order for the brain to develop well. We want good physical exercise. We're learning now that our ability to organize our thoughts are not simply directed out of the prefrontal cortex only, but the cerebellum, which is the organ that controls fluid motor movement, is now shown to be involved in fluid thinking. So as we get involved in good physical activities in childhood, in adulthood, we actually will help our thinking become more fluid. So we want a balance of activities, music lessons, art lessons, to develop all the various faculties of the mind will help the mind develop in a healthy way. But my opinion is there's nothing that tends to help the mind develop more than Bible study and putting our minds in touch with the Infinite One. Because it draws our minds out to contemplate ideas and concepts that are bigger than ourselves alone, which helps the development of the prefrontal cortex.
So it does really make a difference how you develop that cortex, but the best way to develop it is by God's Word.
I think so. And of course, I have to say this, it would depend on which God you're worshiping. If you're worshiping a God who you're terrified of, who is telling you to bow down and scrape lest he throw bolts of lightning down from heaven, that would tend to not develop the prefrontal cortex.
Right.
Because I have patients who come to me that tell me they've been told they're not allowed to ask God questions, that they just have to do what he says without thinking. And as we've already talked about earlier, the God that I understand is revealed in Christ invites us to ask questions. Come, let us reason together. Think it out with me. Talk it over with me.
What about the person who says, what happened to me was so terrible I just really can't forgive? Let's talk about forgiveness here, because a lot of people right now watching the program is battling with either being forgiven or seeking forgiveness.
Yeah, forgiveness is huge, huge. Both sides of what you just said. We struggle and long because of the mistakes we've made to experience the forgiveness. Forgiveness from God, forgiveness from other people that can bring healing to our hearts when we've made mistakes and hurt people. We long for that forgiveness, and we need that forgiveness. But we also need to be able to forgive others. And in my book, I describe 7 myths of forgiveness that impair people's ability to extend forgiveness or to forgive in their hearts the wrongs that have been done to them. And this is part of the insidiousness of sin. I had a lady at church tell me that her daughter was being abused by the daughter's husband. Now, the husband had not abused the lady who was talking to me. This was the mother-in-law. But this woman had bitterness, anger, hatred, resentment in her heart towards the man who was abusing her daughter. A seed had been planted, a seed of sin had been planted in the mother's heart. If she does not forgive him in her heart, then that takes root, and over time her heart becomes hardened. And she becomes like the one who was abusing her daughter. Forgiveness is part of the methods of God that extricate pain, heartache, resentment, and bitterness from our hearts and allows us to heal.
Okay, so what if a person says, and I know somebody watching the program probably said, I said I'm sorry, why can't they just accept the fact that, why can't they extend forgiveness? I said I'm sorry. Well,
and in fact, whether you realize it or not, you were kind of going down the lane of one of the myths. And one of the myths are, I'll forgive when the other person says they're sorry. That we wait for the other person to say they're sorry to extend forgiveness. But in reality, forgiveness comes first. While we were yet sinners, Christ died for us. Father, forgive them. They know not what they're doing. They didn't ask for it, but he extended it. He was revealing what was in his heart. Now, they didn't open their hearts to receive the forgiveness. They weren't transformed by it. They were not now his friends, but Christ's heart was the heart of forgiveness. And we are to have that heart as well, a heart that forgives even when other people don't want to be forgiven.
Now, I like what you're saying, and I'm hearing something that maybe the people listening to the program are also listening to. the forgiveness that you just talked about starts in the heart of the one that was offended.
Yes.
Okay.
Yes. Yes. And one of the myths that hold people up is that person hasn't recognized they've done anything wrong yet. How can I forgive them? They're not even sorry for what they did.
Okay.
But if you don't forgive, then you remain hurt, you remain bitter, you remain angry, and the damage is happening in your heart. Now, another myth. If I forgive them, then I have to trust them.
Mm-hmm.
Forgiveness means restored trust. Oh, no. I had a patient whose husband cheated on her for the 6th time come see me. The first 5 times it happened, the husband, the wife threw him out, and the husband ran to the pastor crying, saying that I've asked the Lord Jesus to forgive me, but my wife has thrown me out. The pastor goes to the wife and says, now, Jesus has forgiven you of your sins. Can't you forgive your husband? And each time she did, and each time she took him back.
Mm-hmm.
She was here to see me, and I pointed out to her it is absolutely essential for her ability to heal, for her to get over the bitterness, the hurt, the heartache, that she forgive him in her heart. But I asked her a question. When you forgive him in your heart, does that change who he is, or does that change who you are?
Mm-hmm.
Does that change what's going on in him? Does that make him now a trustworthy and loyal husband for you to forgive him in your heart?
That's a good point.
And it does not. And so I said, you need to forgive him, but trust cannot be extended until he's trustworthy.
So the forgiveness does not necessarily get followed with, now I trust you because I forgave you.
That's right. But a lot of people think, I won't forgive because I don't want to trust them. They recognize on some level, I can't trust them, so I'm not going to forgive. But when you realize, wait a minute, I can forgive, and I can still wait and hold back on trust until the person is trustworthy.
Right.
It'd be foolish to trust somebody who's not trustworthy.
Because you'll stay bound. You'll stay the slave also in the sense that you haven't extended forgiveness. In other words, you're still nailed to the cross.
That's exactly right, yes.
Here's another one. You said, this is Helen from Florida. Thank you for your question, Helen. You said that we are not responsible for the things that happen to us, but I believe that that the things that happen to us, that we are responsible for the things that happen to us because of the choices we make.
Well, it depends on what she means. If when I say the things that happen to us, I'm talking about those things that happen to us by other people or situations outside of our control. For instance, the people who were in the building in New York on September 11, 2001, they weren't responsible for the fact the plane flew into that building that day. However, if you're a 2-pack-a-day smoker and you get cancer, you are responsible for the fact that you increased your risk of lung cancer by smoking 2 packs a day. If you drive without a seatbelt and intoxicated and get in an accident and get injured, you have a lot of responsibility for the consequences of those choices. But there are many things that happen to us in this world that are not due to the choices we make. A child who is 5 years of age, whose father or grandfather or uncle molests them, are not responsible for what happened to them.
That's right.
The person who did it is responsible. But one of the distortions of childhood, and I use this analogy with my patients, I ask them, imagine that as you walk out of my office today, you see a 40-year-old man cursing at a 5-year-old little girl, just calling her every foul name you've ever heard, screaming right in the face at this child. Do you look over at that situation and go, oh, what a horrible 5-year-old little girl? No. You immediately recognize that the person with the problem is the man. But what does the little girl walk away feeling like?
Somehow that I've done something to warrant this.
That she's a horrible person. Her conclusions, her feelings are inaccurate. They're understandable, but they're not accurate. And people who have been abused as children internalize the abusive events in similar ways, that there's something wrong with me. I'm ugly. I'm gross. I'm nasty. I'm worthless. I'm not as good as other people. God doesn't love me. My daddy, whatever the situation might be. They internalize it in ways that are pejorative and destructive to the self, that are inaccurate but understandable. One of the things we do as adults is we have the opportunity to go back and realize the situation as the observer. The man who is abusing the child is revealing what's in his heart. Our biblical principles help us. From the abundance of the heart, the mouth speaks. Christ is telling us that people reveal what's in them by what they do. They don't reveal what's in the other person.
Very good point. Another person, Jim in Illinois, says, does a person first have to convince themselves that a lie is true before they believe it? It's kind of an oxymoron because a lie never gets true, but do they have to convince themselves that what they're hearing is true before they believe it?
Well, I guess I'm not fully understanding it, because if
it's
they believe it,
strange.
then they've assumed it's true, or else they wouldn't believe it. If they thought it was false, then they wouldn't believe it. So as soon as you believe it, you're acting on the premise that this fact or this story that you're told is true.
Here's another question from a person in Michigan. I have had low self-esteem since childhood. I know God has forgiven me for my past, but I still feel guilty. How do I get some peace?
Excellent question, and this may take a moment or two to help deal with this. God created our mind, as I mentioned earlier, to work in a certain organizational hierarchy. The judgment, the power of choice, the feelings. Self-esteem is a direct outgrowth of whether our mind is working in this way or not. We are all tempted. It says in James, the 1st chapter, no one should say God tempts, because God cannot be tempted by evil, nor does he tempt anyone with evil. But each one of us are tempted and drug away and enticed by our own evil desires or feelings. We all are tempted from within with feelings in various kinds. But we have the power to make a choice to say no to those temptations as our judgment leads us in the healthy direction. Whenever we follow the feelings instead of our good judgment, our judgment is still there, and it looks in on us, and in our own mind we say, I'm ashamed of you. You're weak. You're cowardly. What's wrong with you? You have no backbone. And we begin to condemn ourselves in our own mind. Our estimation of ourself, estimation of ourself is lowered in our own eyes when we let our feelings trump our judgment. Now, I've had the case of a woman who committed adultery. After adultery, she was convicted of guilt. She got on her knees and confessed her sins to God, and this was one occasion, one-time event. Confessed her sin to God and to her husband, and reconciliation with husband occurred. 10 years have gone by, but she continues to be plagued with guilt from adultery. What is going on? She says, I confess over and over, I repent over and over, I pray for peace, but I never get peace. The problem is not the adultery anymore, because she has not committed it again. The problem is the way her mind functions, what I just described. When a person commits adultery, they don't reason it out, looking at the evidence and facts with a clear conscience and make an intelligent choice to honor God with their lives and commit adultery. The way we commit adultery is our feelings trump our judgment. And that's how we commit adultery. Now, what this woman was doing is that even though she was not committing adultery anymore, her mind was still functioning in that same disorderly way where feelings were trumping judgment. A coworker who had wrecked 2 cars recently and didn't have one asked to borrow her car. The patient's judgment stepped in and said, well, no, you've just wrecked 2 cars and my insurance has limitations on it. My judgment says this is not a wise idea. No. But she said she had feelings come in, feelings of insecurity and fear, where I didn't want her to be mad at me. I didn't want her to be angry at me. I wanted her to like me. And so based on these feelings of insecurity, she trumped her own judgment and let the person borrow her car. The exact same process that happened in the adultery. But because there's no commandment that says, thou shalt not let someone borrow your car, she didn't have a specific identification for why she was feeling guilty, so her mind regurgitated the most egregious example of this process, which was the adultery. And that's why she kept feeling the guilt over the adultery over and over again, because her mind was functioning in the same way. When she learned how to exercise her will, to follow the good judgment, and stand up and say, you know, I'd like to let you borrow my car, but given the circumstances, I don't think it's a good idea. I'm sorry, but no. Then she might feel uncomfortable at that moment, but at the end of the day, she has peace with herself, and at the end of the day, she says, I'm proud of you. You did what's right.
And her insurance is still intact.
And her self-esteem, self-worth, and self-confidence all rise automatically.
So what I'm hearing you say then, Doctor, is that some people do things to pacify their own feelings of guilt. Let me give you an example. I like what you said a moment ago, and I want to bring this point out. There are some people that are people pleasers because they are still trying to get rid of the fact that they have this guilt that they have not dealt with. So they are almost to the point where they'll say, yes, I'll do that, no problem. But they'll walk away feeling used and complain to other people that they would just use because they just can't say no to this person.
That's exactly right, and it's because of the same dynamic. Their judgment knows that this is not a healthy choice, but they have such powerful feelings of insecurity and fear, and so desperate to be approved and liked, that they continue to surrender their own judgment to their own feelings of insecurity, which only causes them, in their own judgment, to lose more respect for themselves, their self-esteem and self-worth to fall even lower, which makes them more hungry and more desperate for outside approval to make them feel better, so they're more vulnerable to the same thing happening next time.
What about the overperformers?
Well, let me tell you, the only way out of what we just said is the truth. The truth will set you free. The people who are in this cycle have to recognize what is healthy, what is true, and they have to begin exercising their will to choose to do what is healthy, reasonable, and appropriate in spite of how they feel in the moment. And that brings healing.
That brings also freedom.
Freedom, yes.
Right. They don't feel free to they don't feel obligated to continue going. But I've heard someone, and I don't know if anybody falls in this category, hopefully not. Hopefully this is so isolated, this is not something that's repetitive. But some people say, well, the Bible says if they ask you to go 1 mile, go 2. If they ask for your coat, give them your cloak also. If they hit you on one cheek, turn the other cheek. There's some people that use that in an unhealthy way to continue saying yes over and over and over again. And they kind of put it on God's shoulder.
And the people who do that are people who have disengaged their reason. You see, God wants us to understand His methods and principles and apply them intelligently, but many people want a rule to apply, like a cookie cutter, in every situation. The principle behind what you just described is the principle of love, doing what's in the best interest of that other person that will bring redemption and healing to that other person. In some situations, that might be exactly what that person needs you to do to help let them see the true heart of God. But in other situations, the thing to do might be to say no and not gratify an unhealthy demand or request.
I've seen situations like that as a pastor, and I've said to some people, it's okay to say no. I have it taken care of. It's okay to say no. Are you sure? It's okay to say no. I mean, I could do it. It's okay to say no. And you free them to say no. And when they finally say no, they say, well, I really did have a lot of things to do. I don't know how I was going to fit that in.
Right, exactly.
Have you had that happen before?
Yes, absolutely. And it shows how fearful people are to just speak the truth. You want to know the truth? The truth sets you free.
It's almost like approaching, and I'm using this phrase loosely, or this word loosely, it's almost like approaching a dog that was in a home where the owner kicked him and hit him and threw things at him. Now he finds a new home, and the person is so loving, but the moment they raise their hand, the dog remembers.
That's right, a conditioned response. That's exactly right.
Now, here's another person. What would you say about a mother that dominated all my life? She is deceased, but I cannot get away from some of the things I know she taught me were wrong. Wow, that's powerful.
Yes, and I would say, first off, let's rephrase what she said from I cannot get away to thus far I haven't been able to get away. Because I cannot get away doesn't leave a door open to ever get away. So in her own mind, her own thinking, right there, a modification can say, well, thus far in my life, I haven't been able to get away, but there's a way out. I just haven't found it yet.
That's very good.
And then we have hope. And with that hope, we begin to work, and I would suggest that she get involved with a good therapist that can help her disentangle her own thought processes that are so habitual and so deeply ingrained that she doesn't even see them for herself. The role of a therapist is not to change her thinking. The role of a therapist is to help her see the way she's thinking more clearly with healthy alternatives that she can then intelligently choose to apply to her life.
So she's pretty much put herself in jail, while the person who may have not forced her, but led her into that mindset is no longer holding the key.
I wouldn't want to say that she put herself in jail. I would say that she's exactly right, that she learned this type of thinking.
Kept herself.
Was indoctrinated into this type of thinking by the way she was brought up as a child before she had the cognitive abilities and resources to defend herself against it. Now that she's an adult, however, now that she's an adult, these thoughts and patterns of thinking are so deeply ingrained, she has limited ability to see them clearly for herself. She knows they're not healthy, but she can't exactly put her fingers on it all by herself to extricate herself from it. An external source, a help from outside herself, will be an integral tool that she can then use to apply to her own way of thinking to change her patterns of thinking.
Okay, so in other words, the source of help is not coming from within her, because she has not, to this point, she even used the word, I cannot get free. And that's why he who the Son sets free is free indeed. Doctor, there's something that's a common thread among what we've been talking about tonight. A lot of our questions, and I'll go back to the questions in a moment, but the destroyer within. There's something that each of us has that enables some of us to continue to go in the wrong direction or disables many of us to go in the right direction. Talk about the destroyer within.
The destroyer within, we mentioned a couple of times in several different ways tonight,
Yeah.
but it's that inherited genetic biologic predisposition towards self-centeredness that pulls us and warps our thinking, twists the way we interpret information. We see threats where no threats exist. We see slights where no slights have occurred. We are self-referenced beings that are constantly on the look out for ourselves. And it is only by looking to Christ, experiencing His love, that frees us from the self-reference point of view.
And so when you think about that in a very real sense, let's talk about this counterfeit for faith, because somebody once said that faith is there when I don't have any evidence. And so a lot of things I do by faith. I don't know how it's going to work out. But you say that faith is based on evidence. Talk about that.
Well, yeah, that's a great one. And it's one of those things in Christianity that well-meaning people sometimes can apply in ways that bring injury. Faith is based on our evidence. Faith, by the way, in the Bible is from that Greek word pistis, pistis.
Okay.
And it's also the same word translated trust. And I think in our North American experience or our culture in the 2007, that trust is a better connotation of what the Bible is trying to describe than faith, and the way we hear the word. And I had a patient whose friends told her repeatedly, all you have to do is have faith in Jesus. All you have to do is trust Jesus. And she said to me, but Dr. Jennings, I can't. And she knew I was a Christian, and she was expecting me to say like everyone else, but you need to. But I said to her, of course you can't. And then I asked her this question. I said, if you were in the mall and a stranger came up to you and tapped you on the shoulder and said, let me have the keys to your car and the keys to your house, you can trust me, would you give them to him? She said, no way. I said, if you can't give the keys of your car and the keys of your house to a stranger, how do you expect to give the keys of your life to a stranger? So the Bible says that we are to know God. Knowing God is life eternal. And when we get to know Him, trust is the automatic outgrowth of knowing a trustworthy person. And so our trust in God is based on the evidence that He's given us of His trustworthiness, His reliability, and His existence. And that evidence is abundant and it appeals to our reason.
So the issue is broader than just the idea that I don't have the faith to go forward, but I don't know the one in who I should place my trust. That's a bigger issue.
Yeah, people know about God. If I were to say, do you know about George Bush or do you know about Bill Clinton? You might say, I know maybe too much about them. But if I said, do you know them? Well, no,
I haven't met them.
I don't know them, no. You see, a lot of people spend their life studying about God, but they're still waiting to meet Him.
That's very true. This is a very serious question from Colorado, and I think the person for not putting their name, the question is so serious that it would probably be a giveaway. How can we tell when it is God speaking to us or when it is the devil speaking to us? I suspect my husband is having an affair with my friend, and they both deny it, but a voice inside me tells me that they are.
Interesting question, because I don't see the last half connected to the first half, honestly.
Okay.
Because if she suspects her husband is having an affair, I would suggest her suspicions are based on evidences she did not include in her email. She's suspecting that because husband is coming home late, because of body language and nonverbal signals between the best friend and the husband when they're around each other, because of references that are being made, little innuendos that are being dropped. There are evidences being dropped that her mind is picking up on.
Right.
And that voice is her own inner voice saying to her, something is wrong here. Pay attention. Pay attention. I suspect that's what's going on. Rather than with no evidence going on in her life, out of the blue, there's this suspicious voice coming in her mind from some supernatural source. You know, that's a very good point, because you could never conclude that something is going wrong unless you have some evidence to say this is the basis on which I make this choice, or this is the basis on which I conclude that something is occurring. With that being said, I do have to give a caveat.
Okay.
There are some mental illnesses that are delusional in nature, where because of biological deficits in certain parts of the brain, we can actually hear voices, Schizophrenia is one of those disorders.
Okay.
Feel paranoid, believe suspicious things of a delusional nature when there is no evidence. The evidence is wholly coming from our own mind's distortion of what's happening. And so, with that caveat, I wouldn't want people to think there can never be a case where someone might have that inner voice telling there's an affair, and there is no evidence in society. That can happen. That's a mental illness.
I'm glad you brought that up, because somebody may be saying, well, I know who that person is, and we're not having an affair. It's all in their head. And there are some situations where, as we pointed out earlier, some things are wholly imagined in a person's mind, and it becomes their enduring reality.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Here's another question from Montana. The doctor is using the term trump, T-R-U-M-P. I guess please explain what that means.
It means that when the action of the will follows the direction and the pulling of the feelings rather than the judgment, you are in a situation where your feelings are pulling you in an attracted way to have an affair with someone. Your judgment says no. The choice, if you choose to have that affair, your feelings just trumped your judgment. The choice you made was based on feelings rather than judgment. So feelings have just trumped or overruled or dominated over your own judgment. Your judgment was no longer in control of the course that you took with your life. And this is important not just for what happens in the record books of heaven. This is important for what happens in the neural network of your brain. The choices you make actually cause neurons to be established, neural networks to be laid down, and other neurons to be deleted. By the action of your will, you will activate neurons, and as neurons are activated, certain proteins are produced that strengthen those neurons, recruit other neurons, and establish them healthier. And if neurons are left idle over time and are not used, the brain gets rid of them.
So it's deleting things that you do need, but because it's not being used, it'll base it sometimes on the text in the Bible says that which you have will be taken because of inactivity. I'm paraphrasing primarily.
Yes, the talents, exactly. But it's not just positive things. This is hope for those of us who have things that we struggle with.
Right.
If we, through God's grace, begin exercising the will in healthy channels, the healthy patterns of behavior become stronger, and the unhealthy patterns over time will be deleted.
It's like therapy, physical therapy, to that part of your body that has become inactive.
That's exactly right.
Okay, I like that. I want to remind you also, we'll let you know before the program is over, this book is wonderful, Could It Be This Simple, by Dr. Timothy R. Jennings, M.D. We're going to make sure that before the program is over, you have the information you need to find a way to get a copy of this in your hand, and also to find a way to have him come and maybe do lectures on the very topic of healing the mind, which, by the way, as I'm looking through this booklet and even some of the questions we've talked about, this is far more engaging than 2 hours. And it's far more, there's so much more there that it's kind of like a smorgasbord. You walk up to this huge bar of food and salads and different types of things, and you engage in a taste testing program that before you even get your food, you're full.
Well, I wanted the book to be a comprehensive manual for lay people that they could actually take hold of, read for themselves, and understand what God is trying to accomplish in their heart and mind so that they can intelligently cooperate with Him to experience that healing here and now.
I think that's what's going to happen. I'm looking through it and I'm thinking to myself, I need to get home and start reading this book. It's not a long one, but it's very, very important as a pastor to add the information that will cause us to be able to look at the Bible in a fuller sense. Here's a question. We talked about this a moment ago, the lady that had she was suspicious of an affair, and I don't know what we said to activate this train of thought, but another question came from Larry in Idaho, sorry. What are the boundaries between flirting and friendliness and trusting and jealousy? I see the two. What are the boundaries between flirting and friendliness and trusting and jealousy? It's almost, it sounds like a question with a lot more attached to it than the...
First thing that comes to my mind is Matthew chapter 5. Christ says, if you look at another woman with lust in your heart, you've already committed adultery with him. That question... With her, yes. Okay. With her, thank you. That question seemed to be focusing on a behavioral answer. How far can I go? But the real issue is the issue of the heart. If your heart is focused on a improper interaction, somehow getting attention for yourself or arousing her desire for you, regardless of what behavior you're actually doing, you're flirting.
Right.
If, however, your heart's desire is to help her to know Christ, to build her up, to be an encouragement to her in a difficult time, then you're being a friend. Mm-hmm. And so the real issue is not the specific behavior, but the intention of the heart and how you carry that out.
Now, you mentioned something I want to build on, because sometimes, because of personal attractions, and as a pastor who does counseling, there are certain people that I refer. I would not counsel, because I know that they have I don't use the phrase predispose, but you could sense that there's more than just, I want to talk with you about this problem. There's an attraction, and that sometimes is used as a reason to get together and have a one-to-one audience. And you have to be wise and not condone that and put yourself in a situation where feelings can be swayed one way or the other.
Excellent point.
So that's important. They say, people in positions, doctors such as yourself, pastors, people in visible positions, people of power, people of influence, tend to sometimes be an attracting point to people looking for someone who says, oh, the doctor has all the answers, why can't my husband have all the answers? Or the pastor has such wisdom, why can't my husband have all this wisdom? And the attraction is inappropriate from the very word go.
Right.
So I think that when the person talks here about friendliness and flirting and trusting and jealousy, we've got to first trust the Lord in His Word, not to put ourselves in a situation that's kind of paramount to being at the tree talking to the serpent saying, I'll get away okay.
And the trusting and jealousy part?
Yeah.
Trust has two sides to it.
Okay.
Our ability to trust, and there are some people who will not extend trust. They're suspicious of everyone for hurt reasons in the past. And there's the other side of that, the trustworthiness of the person you're interacting with. So both sides have to be there. You have to be able to trust, but you also have to be dealing with a trustworthy person. And trust is based on the trustworthiness of that individual, which requires experience, not claims. And too many people are willing to extend trust just because someone said, I'll never do it again. Just on their word alone, without any evidence whatsoever.
Or the very nicely attired person says, don't worry about it, you can trust me.
Exactly. Just on your word alone.
You know how often that happens in interaction with financial things? Somebody may say, would I sell you a lemon?
Exactly. Same principle at work. How do you know that person? What evidence do you have?
He looks so honest.
Yeah.
The very basis of deception.
I felt so good about it. There you go. Feelings leading us into temptation again.
And I mention that because there are so many people that are drawn in by, well, he was so nice when I walked into his office. He was so appropriate. His manner was just, yes, he put together the perfect equation for getting you to sign the bottom line. Mm-hmm. And you walked away. I just mentioned this. I thought about this, but there are so many people that don't think they go on feeling and hoping things will work itself out. In our nation right now, there are over 2 million homes, or even more than that. I think I'm underestimating the amount of people that went into these variable mortgages, not really counting the costs. And they said because of that, there could be over $1 trillion hit to the economy because of all these homes that could go into foreclosure in just a matter of time because they didn't count the costs.
That's right.
So do we count the cost before we make the decision?
Excellent point. Using our reason and judgment rather than just the feelings of the moment.
Here's another one. How exceptional this doctor is. That's a statement. Thank you so much. I have never heard a doctor with so much wisdom and knowledge. Thank you very much. And I agree. That's why I'm enjoying this program. I'm learning a whole lot, and I could be psychoanalyzing him through my questions, but I think he's passing the test. Just kidding. I'm not psychoanalyzing you. You probably... Anyway, let's go on to this next one. Francis in California. My mother and my husband professed to be Christians, and yet my mother-in-law ruined our marriage by moving in with us, and no respect was shown to me. I've been out of my home for 2 years. She asked me to leave, and she and he are very happy together. What makes a man a mama's boy? This is a good one. Help me with this one, doctor.
Yeah,
I tell you, there's a lot there.
Yes, and it's not that uncommon, actually. I've seen this before. And I think it's a failure at the onset of the marriage itself, where we are instructed in God's Word that a husband is to leave his mother and father and cleave to his wife.
That's right.
And at the time of marriage, there is to be a purposeful choice made in the heart and mind of both husband and wife that they are committing themselves to each other for better or for worse. And that while we don't turn our backs on our responsibility to our parents, that we don't allow those relationships to ever come between the marriage relationship, that marriage relationship is sacrosanct, and if push comes to shove, we must side with our spouse.
That's right. I was in the same. God, my mother's resting now in the Lord, and I can mention this. That you don't want to cast any bad shadow on people that are alive. My mother is resting now in the Lord. But I remember when I first met my mother, and that was the same situation. And after meeting her for many, many years, she moved in with my wife and I. And because I hadn't known her most of my life and things got bad, I had to ask her to leave. And she said, "How could you do that to your mother?" Well, I said, at this point in life, Mom, I got to make a choice between you and my wife. I'm not divorcing you as a mother, but I'm surely not getting rid of my wife.
Excellent, excellent. Now, what I would suggest is often the case, and the question is why would this happen, is oftentimes there's unhealthy attachment and unhealthy guilt or inappropriate guilt, where somehow the son is being manipulated by guilt from his mother, that he would feel guilty for not taking his mother in. And it's some form of manipulation, usually through unhealthy forms of guilt or inappropriate guilt.
Okay. Here's Anonymous from New York. What causes defensiveness in people? It's a very broad question.
Fear and insecurity. Ultimately, it's the selfishness within. We're afraid of what will happen to us. We're afraid of consequence. We're afraid of rejection. We're afraid of abandonment. We're afraid of criticism. We're afraid of not being loved. And so because of our fears, if people should really know us or know how we see ourselves, we're afraid of those consequences, so we defend ourselves. We become irritated when people should point out some defect in us, rather than thanking them if they see some defect for the opportunity for another opportunity for growth and advancement.
This question keeps, for some reason, coming back to me, and I'm just going to go ahead and ask it because I don't want to minimize it. What happens when you crack your skull? I fell 17 feet off of a ladder. What do I do for it? Do more than take an aspirin.
I think they need to see their neurologist, because the head injury could result in various forms of brain injury, blood vessel injuries, and ultimately they need to see a neurologist and have a neurologist evaluate, and there can be certain forms of neuropsych testing that can actually quantify what parts of the brain have been damaged, if they've been damaged.
Okay. Because I saw that earlier and I thought, well, we didn't mention that earlier about falling, but 17 feet, I mean, it's a long way. Catherine, here's a question. As a Christian, when you are in a toxic relationship, how do you deal with it?
Excellent question. We have to come back to principles first. And let me give a quick example about the toxic relationship.
Okay.
If it's truly toxic, imagine living in a area near a nuclear facility that has been leaking radiation, and so your home is a toxic radiation zone. Would it surprise you if you got sick and your health began to fail? Of course not.
Not at all.
And you realize you're in a toxic zone, so you extricate yourself from that and you get good treatment. You're going to get well and things start improving. What happens if you move back into the toxic zone? You're going to get sick again. If it's truly a toxic zone and the toxic zone cannot be cleaned up, then it requires one to remove themselves from the toxic zone. Some people have a difficult time with this, but the greatest of all the commandments is love the Lord your God with all your heart, all your mind, all your soul, and all your strength. And the second is your neighbor as yourself. Where does a spouse fall? In the God category or the closest neighbor category? We have a responsibility to present ourselves to God in the best condition for the greatest usefulness possible. And if we're in a situation with an abusive, dominating, controlling, toxic spouse that has no desire for healing or reconciliation or following God's plan, we have a responsibility to not let them destroy our soul. Our soul is God's. And how much better would the world have been if Adam would have made that decision for God rather than for Eve?
That's right. Here's another person, Virginia. Will this lecture help anyone that is in the deepest of depression? I don't think that's the purpose of this program, but...
well, if it helps them to realize, if they're in the deepest of depression and not getting help because they believe it's just a problem of faith, and they've heard tonight that depression is a physical illness of the brain, and it leads them to go and seek professional help for their illness, then yes, this program may very well help them.
Oh, good. Thank you. See, I don't even have the answer. That's why he's the doctor and I'm not. What is the book about? Could it be this simple? Well, we mentioned that, but reiterate that for a person.
The purpose of this book is written for lay people to understand God's principles for healing the mind so they can cooperate with Him intelligently making intelligent choices to apply those principles to their mind here and now to experience healing, regeneration, and recreation of Christ-like character in this world.
Okay, so in a nutshell, there's nothing impossible for God if you use the right principles with the understanding of how to approach any situation.
That's right. And remember, the battle between Christ and Satan is a battle for the mind. The devil uses lies. He's the father of lies. And as we believe those lies, we talked earlier, the power of belief. And he holds people in bondage by the lies he gets you to believe. Lies about God, lies about faith, lies about what you can and cannot achieve through the power of Christ in your life. The lies that he gets you to believe hold you in bondage. This book is designed to help to teach you God's methods for setting for being set free from such bondage.
Here's another question. Sandra, my son is attention deficit and was adopted and was extremely oppositional, and I know I did many things wrong in his life. How do you get a child, he is now 20, to realize, and by the way, she says, how do you get a child? How do you get a young adult or an adult to realize help and healing is available when he doesn't even want to look back or remember the past? This person doesn't want to look back.
A great question. The first thing that comes to my mind is the story of the prodigal. The prodigal son walked away from his rich and wealthy father, went into wild living. That father was a wealthy man. He could have sent his agents after the son to work on that son, to plead with that son. When that son found himself in the pigsty eating pig food, he could have sent him Pizza Hut and put him up in a Motel 6 each night for a clean shower, but he didn't do it. He left the son to reap the consequences of those choices until the son came to the point to realize, hey, I've brought myself here, and I am going to go home. If your son doesn't want to look at the past, the best thing you can do is to pray for him, that God will protect him from total self-destruction, but allow enough consequences to come to bear that will wake him up to his current situation, and then the door of hope is open.
Spiritually said, I was going to think the same thing. I thought the same thing. God doesn't force us, but he could govern our situations that will ultimately say, I need God.
Yes.
Here's another question. Cleo from Wisconsin. I would like to know, well, this is a very unusual question, but I guess it has some merit because they asked the question. I would like to know if a snoring condition would affect your spiritual walk with God. You feel tired because you don't sleep.
Excellent question. And snoring is one of the symptoms associated with a disorder called obstructive sleep apnea. In obstructive sleep apnea, this is a condition where when you fall asleep, the soft tissues relax and cover over the windpipe. And so when you try to breathe in your sleep, the windpipe is covered so no air moves, oxygen levels fall in the body, and then as they fall to critical levels, the brainstem alerts you, you wake up just enough to tighten up those soft tissues, take a gas of breath, and get some oxygen and fall back to sleep again. What's happening during the night is several things that are very bad for the brain. One, you're not getting good oxygen to the brain all night, and the brain needs its oxygen. Yeah, so that's not good. And secondly, you're not getting through your normal sleep cycles, and thus you're not getting the regeneration that your brain and body needs, which will definitely impact on your ability to think and reason, which will undermine your spirituality because you can't comprehend God in the way He wants you to comprehend Him. So if you're having this difficulty, go to your doctor, ask for a sleep study. They'll put you in a sleep lab, they'll document this, and there's treatments for it.
Okay, so there's answers for that. I thought of this as greatly medical, but hey, you're the doctor. I mean, that was great. Here's another question. How does art lessons help your mind? Depends on what you're drawing also. Go ahead.
The mind has different functions or capabilities to it. What art lessons do is help develop imagination, help develop spatial relationships, creativity, which comes out of the prefrontal cortex but also is involved in the parietal lobes. And so art lessons can help stimulate the interconnections between the different parts of the brain as you apply those principles. Now, art lessons don't necessarily have to be drawing. There's different types of art. There's multiple different types of art.
Musical art.
Musical art is exactly right. Yeah.
Okay. What are the signs of someone who is anorexic? Discuss anxiety and panic attacks. I guess they want to know what are some of the signs of a person dealing with anorexia.
Well, anorexia would be somebody whose weight is dropped to critical levels, or weight is dropped substantially, and they restrict their food intake because of a feeling of or perception of being fat, and they try to control their perceived obesity through restricting of caloric intake. And what can happen if it's severe is they can actually lose weight to the point that it is critical. Electrolytes can be thrown off, and this can be a life-threatening condition. This condition is very amenable or treatable through psychotherapy rather than pharmacotherapy. Not that medicines don't have a place, but ultimately medicines will not resolve an anorectic condition. There needs to be a changing in the thinking processes and the relating processes in the mind. It's a software problem generally that can cause some hardware difficulties. And what was the second part of that question?
And anxiety and panic attacks also.
Yeah, anxiety and panic attacks. Panic, I love panic. I wish we had time to really go into it, because panic is often and frequently driven from the way we think and how we think. Just a quick example. When you were a kid, did you ever go swimming and swim underwater, racing your brothers or sisters to who could go the farthest? And come to that point where you had to come up because you couldn't go a moment longer. Imagine at that point somebody reaches in and holds your head down underwater. What does that feel like?
Oh,
that feels like panic. Now, we can find ourselves in situations in life where we have so much on us, so many problems, responsibilities, burdens, bills, things coming down upon us, that we feel like we can't get our head above water. I feel like I'm drowning in it all. It's not necessarily self-destructive, it's just there's so much on us. And what we need is, instead of some medication, we need a reorganization of those things so we feel like our head is above water again. That's just one example of many of a psychological reason that can contribute to this feeling of panic.
Well, Doctor, we have covered so much. I want to make sure that our viewers and listeners not get away without having the information that they need, because Dr. Jennings, I can't wait to go home and start cracking the pages of this book and start reading, but I know somebody else is in the same situation but maybe want to invite you to come and do some seminars and lectures. Here's the information that you need to have this blessing of how you can discover how simple it really can be to be healed in the mind.
If you would like to contact Dr. Tim Jennings or find out how you can receive a copy of his book, Could It Be This Simple? Or invite him to come to your area, you can write to Come and Reason, Post Office Box 6187, Dalton, Georgia 30722. That's Come and Reason, Post Office Box 6187, Dalton, Georgia 30722. Or you can order online at comeandreason.com. It's all one word, and again, it's comeandreason.com. Write to him today. He'd love to hear from you.
Friends, if you notice, come and reason is a result of Isaiah 1:18.
That's right.
Let us reason together. I know there's so many Bible texts that gives us the spiritual foundation, such as let this mind be in you, think on these things, Romans 12, verse 1 and 2. But I want to give you a few more questions before our hour is gone, and maybe this one will take a short answer. But a person says her boyfriend is bipolar and accuses her all the time of having affairs with men, when in fact she's innocent, and he uses her for her money. How can I get him to go into a healthy direction?
Well, I would say to her that her concern needs to be how does she get herself to go in a healthy direction. Okay. She's already cited evidences that he has given her of his character. He uses her and he accuses her falsely. Mm-hmm. These are evidence that reveal the kind of heart he has. She needs to take that evidence and ask the question, do I want to spend my life with a man who accuses me falsely and uses and exploits me? Is that the sign of a Christ-like person? Or do I take that evidence and make an intelligent decision to say, he's not qualified to be with me and in the relationship?
I tell you, that's so important. You can't force a person, but you can make decisions for yourself. What could I expect? The end result of all of this primarily comes down to what in our walk? I think you said it's impossible to heal the mind without knowing what?
Knowing God. We cannot, He is our creator, our designer, and He is the source of life and truth. And it is impossible for us to actually experience true healing without that personal one-on-one relationship with God.
So all the psychoanalysts, all the psychology, all the psychiatry, all those things coupled together cannot equal the great dose we come to receive in knowing God.
And that's exactly what He wants to do, is heal us. To know God is eternal life.
Well, Doctor, it's been a tremendous blessing educationally, spiritually, because your work is not just based on your education, but based on your knowledge of the Word of God and your relationship with Him. And friends, as you know, here at 3ABN, we try to bring the best programming we can to you, and we appreciate your prayers and your financial support that make this a reality, and to continue supporting the programs and the network going in the direction that it does. But we pray that God will be with you and bless you, that your mind will be whole, not because of what you did, but because of what Jesus continues to do. God bless you, and have a great time in Christ.